Hello, this is Jay Mitchell. We are back with another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, what are your thoughts about this? Cudahy Vice Mayor Cynthia Gonzalez uploaded a video inciting street gangs to violently confront federal officers, posted by Equivalent Sun 3816, and that's a cross post from the Greater Los Angeles subreddit. And yeah, of course, Reddit's going to defend something like that because, if the out group was doing it, it would be incitement of violence. But since the in group's doing it, it's completely justified. And yeah, personally, I think, if you want to use violent rhetoric, I'm for freedom of speech. I think as long as you're not getting your hands dirty, you should be able to say whatever you want to. But with that being said, you gotta be aware of people's double standards as well. As I always like to say, most people only have double standards in regards to politics. That's the only standard they have. And also that, most people don't have values, only teams. I'm sure if the member of the Republican Party was saying, inciting street gangs to violently confront federal officers, it would be literally Nazi Germany. But since it's a Democrat doing it, it's entirely justified. That's my thoughts there. Next we have, horrific extremists are going full Nazi in Tarrant County, Texas as GOP chair runs for office, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the Something Is Wrong 2024 subreddit, and that looks like some tweets from Beau French. Rumors are rampant that I'm running, just so you know, I am 1, deport 100 million, 2, stop all illegal immigration until this is complete, 3, when we do restart legal immigration, make them swear to uphold American Christian values or they are denied, 4, if at any time in the future they push commie or non-Christian values, deport. There has been debate recently whether MAGA is conservative or not. As a conservative MAGA, I can say there is a divide most in an age where old school conservatives want to hang on to principles. Understand that the Constitution is our foundation without we wouldn't be here. But our Constitution relies on a civil society that shares a common culture. You can't take third world savages, deport them in the U.S. en masse, and maintain a functioning order. MAGA understands the mass deportations solve almost every single problem in America. Without them, the Constitution becomes irrelevant. It simply won't matter when millions of Islamic radicals are taking over and using the Constitution to kill Christians. And yeah, personally, I think that's mostly just kind of bait. Everything's kind of engagement bait these days in regards to social media. But yeah, I don't think you should be deporting 100 million because that's like a third of the country. But ultimately, if he wins and he wants to enact his agenda as much as possible, the state has the legal monopoly on the use of force to justify doing whatever it wants to. So yeah, it's not something I personally care for. But ultimately, those in positions of power oftentimes can't be held accountable, and that's why I think we need to decentralize power. No one should have. It's interesting. Progressives are always against monopolies, except for the state. They love the state and its monopoly on legal use of force, and that's not something I think is very libertarian. So yeah, that's my thoughts there. Then we have birthright citizenship case hosted by Mundane Image 14. They said, 2, respondents contend that universal injunctions, looks like they're getting this from the official docket of the Supreme Court, so it's a bit wordy and legalese, so, I'm gonna skip over that. And then they added, so just because not a pregnant woman in the country joined the suit, they can't get relief from the courts, despite the executive orders like this one is questionable applies to persons who are born in the United States after 30 days from the date of this order, which is pretty universal, so blocking kind seems like something to do. And then the more of the docket, they said, that's the reason for this reason. These injunctions are the administration's policy versus authority. But hey, let's just ignore that, shall we? And then they said that the sentence glorious. And then, yeah, personally, I think, birthright citizenship, I personally think, just because you're born in the U.S. doesn't mean you should be automatically entitled to citizenship. But ultimately, that's what the Constitution says. So if you want to make a constitutional amendment to get rid of that, I think you should be able to. But with that being said, I do think birthright citizenship is the constitutional law currently. So if you like that, that's okay. I personally don't really care too much for it, but I could really go either way. But ultimately, right now I think it looks like it's here to stay. But if they do ever get rid of it, I wouldn't care too much. I think it's nice that the U.S. provinces citizenship to anyone born here, but that does lead to some bad faith actors to have like anchor babies so they can stay here forever without getting deported, and that's not something I particularly care for either. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Supreme Court says states can limit access to online porn, posted by CH4Locks from HuffPost.com, and that's a tough crosspost from the technology subreddit. And yeah, personally, I'm not too wild about porn, but with that being said, porn's practically a religion on Reddit, so of course Reddit would care. And it definitely is an interesting discussion. If the state does want to restrict porn for those under 18, that does sound like it's like a good idea in theory, but ultimately, I definitely think that gives the government too much power over the internet. And frankly, one of my big concerns when it comes to government is them having too much power over the internet, because right now the internet's kind of a bastion for free speech and free expression, even though it's kind of been going downhill in that regard since like 2012 or so. But regardless, I would say that the state shouldn't be involved in any internet censorship, no matter how good it might seem or how much I might agree with it, because ultimately, I do think people who are under 18 shouldn't be looking at porn, but ultimately, it should be the role of the parent or guardian to stop them from looking at porn rather than that of the state, I would say. And that should be, I would say very much, is the libertarian position. That's my thoughts there. Then we have Supreme Court upholds South Carolina's ban on Medicaid funds for Planned Parenthood from NPR.org, posted by Baton 13. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian solution here is if taxpayers want to fund Medicaid, they should be able to do so. And if they want to fund Planned Parenthood, they should be able to do so. But ultimately, I think the taxpayer should choose where their taxpayer money is going to, rather than just having it being thrown around all willy nilly. And that's my thoughts there. I personally don't really care for Planned Parenthood. I'm more on the pro-choice side, but Planned Parenthood just really seems to be more on the pro-abortion side at this point. And I definitely do think if a woman wants to get an abortion, I do think it's a bodily autonomy issue. With that being said, I don't think taxpayers should be forced to pay for it if they don't want to, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have a visual of North Carolina gerrymandering. Even though a majority of residents voted Democratic, Republicans still took the House plus Senate, and that's posted by Bendini Image 13, and that's a cross post from the North Carolina subreddit. And yeah, I think it's interesting how whenever Reddit calls stuff like this out, it's always the members of the outgroup doing it. New York has horrible gerrymandering as well, but there it benefits the Democrats instead of the Republicans. So of course Reddit would never be bothered to call that out, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have Sotomayor rips Clarence Thomas ruling that lets religious groups take over public schools from dailyvoter.com, posted by Puffin Fan, and that's cross post from the Anything Goes News subreddit. And yeah, personally, this is just more Reddit editorializing on when it comes to its agenda. The case was really about letting parents be able to withdraw their kids if they have a problem with the lesson, especially in regards to if it was an LGBTQ lesson. And yeah, but on Reddit, of course, that makes that you need to stay for the LGBTQ lessons or else you're a fascist. And yeah, just because some people might have problems with LGBTQ in the schools doesn't mean it makes them automatically fascist. Increasingly, that's why I wouldn't send your kid to public school at all. Increasingly, it's all just activists teaching to make them want to become like a Greta Thunberg rather than skills like learning about math or history. And yeah, that's personally why I don't really care for public schools at all, and why the libertarian position is to get government out of schools and libraries, because increasingly they'll just use them to push their statist agenda, and that's not something I particularly care for. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have Trump calls birthright citizenship of the Constitution a hoax, posted by CH4Locks, and that's cross post from the Colt Headquarters subreddit, and that's a true from Donald Trump on Truth Social. Giant win in the United States Supreme Court. Even the birthright citizenship hoax has been indirectly hit hard. It had to do with the babies of slaves, same year, not the scamming of our immigration process. Congratulations to Attorney General Pam Bondi, Solicitor General John Sauer, and the entire DOJ. News conference at the White House, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And yeah, personally, I don't really care. We talked about this earlier. I don't really care for birthright citizenship, but right now, it's in the Constitution, and I do think, it definitely is. It can be abused, like Trump says. But with that being said, I personally wouldn't agree if it's a hoax. And if they want to amend it out of the Constitution, I think ultimately citizenship. The government can choose who is and isn't a citizen. Because they have the monopoly on legal force, and yeah, ultimately, I could go either way, but ultimately the government will justify what it justifies, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have Governor Cox declares June 29th a statewide day of prayer and fasting for rain in Utah from governor.utah.gov, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, I personally think that's kind of more of a virtue signal than anything else. And yeah, I personally think we should have a separation of church and state. But that being said, this is kind of just like, not too offensive, but of course on Reddit, anything remotely related to Christianity is automatically be seen as offensive, because if Reddit was run in the country, we'd have nationally enforced atheism, and you wouldn't be able to worship at all, or the woke would throw you in the camps or straight up execute you for doing so. And yeah, personally, I think that's not the right way either. I personally, if the governor wants to declare a day of prayer and fasting for rain, I think he should be able to. And if you want to have problems with that, that's fine. Just be aware that people might have problems with some of your positions as well. Then we have Justin is not happy about Trump's push to remove Thomas Massie from Congress, from Imgur.com, posted by Donald Key. And that's a tweet from Justin Amash. MAGA Inc. is slowly showing its priorities, working to be the most principled and constitutionally conservative person in Congress while embracing and endorsing unprincipled, big government-loving neocon hacks like Lindsey Graham. And he was quote tweeting Eric Daltrey. Just in, Trump PAC launched his $1 million TV ad buy against Thomas Massie and posted aggressive primary campaign against Massie for Axios. MAGA Kentucky is making the purchase. And yeah, personally I think Thomas Massie is one of the only duopoly politicians I might vote for if he ever does get the presidential nomination. But with that being said, Trump has shown time and time again that he's going to go after people who dissent from him and badmouth him regardless of anything else. And yeah, that's why you can't. That's why I personally think Rand Paul plays it safer when it comes to staying principled, but also not trying to badmouth Trump too much. Because if you badmouth Trump too much, he'll kick you out of pretty much the party entirely, like Jeff Flake or Liz Cheney. And yeah, it's not something I particularly care for. And hopefully Massie doesn't get primaried. But if he does, that's just how it goes sometimes, I would say. And yeah, they already killed his wife. So it definitely shows they're out to get him, I would say. And especially the Israel lobby, the Israel lobby is the one who's really out to get him. I think they might have been the ones who really killed his wife, despite what they say it might be been a health thing. But I think it might have been Mossad as well, the Israeli CIA, and that's my thoughts there. Then we have ICE/CBP uses explosives to blast a ray into a U.S. citizen's house and home in LA while she was with her 2 young kids, listed by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosswords from the Public Freakout subreddit. And yeah, that's not something I particularly care for, but ultimately the state can use whatever weapons it wants against you since they have the legal monopoly on use of force, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. Then we have GOP 2025, let's raise the debt ceiling $5 trillion from by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the Politics People Blue Sky subreddit, and that looks like a or a post from T-Pain. GOP 2021, the debt is out of control. 2022, 2023, 2024, the debt is out of control. GOP 2025, let's raise the debt ceiling $5 trillion. And yeah, it just goes to show you how, the GOP pretends to be fiscally responsible, but they're just the same, spend like there's no tomorrow politicians like the Democrats are. The only difference is when they're out of power, they mark themselves that they are allowed to say more fiscally conservative stuff since they're not the one to control the budget. But the second they take power, they'll just spend like the Democrats will. Then we have Nebraska is going broke, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosswords from the Leopard Ate My Face subreddit, and that looks like a post from J. Merritt 1958. They never actually fought any of this through. Nebraska may go bankrupt, and then it looks like the headline, the story says, Trump received a call from Mr. Pillen, the governor of Nebraska, and he's a problem. Turns out migrant farm labor fled the state, causing a crash in tax revenues, and China has held back $2 billion of soybean orders from Nebraska farmers, while the expensive planting already being sunk into the ground. Overall, Nebraska is facing an loss of $15 billion of sales from its economy and $350 million of sales from its tax base. They are the first red states that they need help. And yeah, ultimately, if deporting the migrants is going to affect your labor people, then that can be a problem. But ultimately, you should have known that before you voted for Trump. He does say he was going to deport as many people as possible. And yeah, it's not something I personally care for. Deport the criminals, the thugs, and the rapists, not just the farm workers who aren't doing really anything wrong. But ultimately, the government can choose to deport whoever it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. They could break into my house and deport me right now, and there's really nothing I could really do about it because they have the monopoly on legal use of force, and they control the police, the military, and the court system as well. And that's not something that I particularly care for. I think everyone should justify using whatever force they feel like, and rather than just let the state have legal monopoly on it. And yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.